So I do want to discuss critical limitations of the Odyssey platform. As a web-based tool, if you don't have the web, it is less effective. As Anthony can attest, I have often demoed. I've done many demonstrations of Atlas where I've been in awkward places, like taking the Excella train from Philadelphia, where I live, down to DC, and I'll be like giving a demo, and I'll go through the Baltimore tunnel, and then I'll be like, Senna, this thing doesn't work, and then I realize that I have no internet connection, and I only partially blame him for the lack of responsiveness for that.
Is there an API connection to the vocabularies?
Yeah, so good question. So let's talk a little bit about the technology. So Atlas itself is a front-end web page, but basically it is making API calls to a hosted environment. And so when we talk about the tech stack that we're actually working with here, there's several different packages, but the two that you're really interacting with here, Odyssey has a web API, which has a large number of services that are provided to do things like ask a question of a vocabulary and retrieve back information. And Atlas is simply a web-based instantiation of providing those services in a user interface. And so if you are once we're able to show you what you can do, if you become interested in installing this, effectively what you are going to be doing is installing this API service and then installing the Atlas web interface on some web server. We have what you are currently, once we get enough bandwidth to get to it, what you're currently touching is a hosted environment that James set up in the AWS instance. So there is the way in which you could have an environment like what you're going to get to play with here that could be stood up. Organizations have chosen to locally within their own institution stand up an API and stand up an API endpoint and the Atlas tool. But also on the Odyssey website, if you just go to odyssey.org/web/Atlas, you'd be able to get to the same user interface, in which case that is using a public instantiation of the API that is out on the Odyssey tools.
What's an API?
Application Programming Interface. So basically the way in which we can have the web page talk to the data services and ask specific questions to render back information. So for example, imagine that we had this vocabulary and I wanted to ask a question like, find me the concepts that contain the word atrial fibrillation. That could be constructed as a specific type of a query. That would be an API call where you basically send the string you wanted to search for, atrial fibrillation, to the database. An analytic routine would be performed on the database, namely search for the concepts that have atrial fibrillation, and a result set would be returned back. And so the Atlas user interface is just making that call and then rendering the information onto the user interface. Any other questions? Yes. Oh, back up. Sorry. There we go. Any other questions while I awkwardly stall? I'm curious if anybody wants their registration fee back yet. I'll reimburse you for tomorrow's too. Dan.
How would you point Atlas at a different data source?
So Dan's question is, how would we point Atlas at a different data source? So let's talk a little bit about the architecture, just how this works. So most organizations that have decided to adopt, there's no mic working now, Gotham, so I'll try to be loud. Most organizations who have chosen to adopt the Odyssey toolkit have started by installing it locally, in which case in their own environment, usually in some intranet that they have inside their own organization, they have their own patient-level data sets that they've converted to an OMOP common data model, and that typically will sit on some data server somewhere. It might be physically on an appliance or some server on premises, or it might be that they're stored in the cloud somewhere, but there's a data server. And then separately there is a web server that needs to be able to talk to that data server. Different organizations, power's coming back, that's encouraging. Excellent, so we'll wait for that projector to come on. Different organizations have, so some organizations have access to one database, in which case they've got one data server, they put their data on that one data server, and they're connecting their web instance to that. Some organizations have multiple databases at their disposal, and for those, there's different architecture decisions that could be made. Sometimes different databases are sitting on different data servers. Sometimes they have like one appliance and they just have loaded the patient level data. Stop.
Lost power again.
Lost power again. Lost power again. Okay. Oh, we lost power up here. Okay. Well, I'm just going to scream like an idiot for a while. What is the case for an Atlas instance, though, is that Atlas as a tool allows you to configure to point to as many databases as you want, and those could be on as many different servers as you want. So many organizations have chosen to only point Atlas to their local databases, whether that be on one data server or multiple data servers. However, explicitly, the way that Atlas was set up, if we all just allowed for our data to be publicly shared, we could all connect our Atlas instance to each other's data and do stuff directly. Of course, many organizations have concerns about data privacy and concerns about who could potentially touch their data. And so right now within the community, I'm not aware of anybody who's opened up their data server to public internet calls from other organizations. And so most people, their local Atlas install is only connecting to their local data. It's for that reason that when Greg presents about Arachne, Arachne serves as a tool to enable network analyses whereby you don't have to open a port to your databases, but rather the Arachne serves as a workflow manager to allow the code to transfer between organizations and for there to be appropriate approvals of the analyses so that the evidence can be exchanged without having to actually have your technical environment exposed to every institution. All right. Okay, so we're going to do our best we can right now. So we've been told that the Wi-Fi broadband should be expanded, and hopefully you guys can connect. And if you do, that's great. And if you don't, just have a little bit of patience. I'm going to do the demo. I'm going to the same exact website as you because we know this isn't on the AWS side. It's just on the broadband side. But I'm going to that same website. I'm just connecting to Wi-Fi through my phone. And I've got a half a bar. So, I mean, what could go wrong, right? I was, before the break, was just introducing that what we just described conceptually for the vocabulary is actually a capability in the Atlas user interface called search, where you can just do a vocabulary search of anything that you're interested in. So I just, let me go back. On the home page, you see all of those menu options on the left-hand side. If you just click on search, this search screen will pop up. And just like a Google search or whatever, you should can just search for whatever you want. I'll search for atrial fibrillation. I just type in the word and hit enter, and that just went and explored the vocabulary. And importantly, what you can see that, if you want to watch along, or hopefully it's on the screen back there, what you can see that happened is by searching for the words atrial fibrillation, what was brought back was 164 concepts about atrial fibrillation, or more specifically, containing the string atrial fibrillation. And 164 concepts is hardly unambiguous to the question that was asked before. And so we need to be able to look through each of these things to understand what they actually are. And so just to orient you to what you're seeing on the screen, in this screen to the bottom here, we have a table showing the entire 164 entries that came back when we searched for atrial fibrillation. And this table is largely the information that's in that concept table. You have the concept ID, the original concept code, its name, a class, which is basically the subcontext that's available in the vocabulary, a domain and a vocabulary, and these two columns of RC and DRC if you are connected to your own database, these would actually contain the counts of how often that code actually exists in your particular database. Now, on the left-hand side, you're seeing various dimensions that we can sort or filter this information between. So you can see that when I search for atrial fibrillation, there are many different vocabularies that contain the notion of atrial fibrillation. So there are 52 different things in SNOMED that contain atrial fibrillation. There are 48 NDC codes, there are 29 recodes, etc. We can also see that we can explore the different classes that are represented, the different domains across the OMOP Common Data Model, and to that vocabulary thing, we can see that some of these things are non-standard concepts, some are standard concepts, and some are classification systems.
Question.
Yep.
What's the difference between stuff in red and stuff in,
Yep.
sort of pinkish?
Yep, so a question was, I see that there's colors on the screen. What do those colors represent? And it's a good question. So a very important notion of this, just going to keep going, pretend like it's not happening. So an important part of this vocabulary is this idea that you have non-standard things or source codes. You have standard things, which is what we all want to use as a community, and then we have classifications that can group things together. And so to promote that notion, what we've done is we've color-coded these various concepts, whereby red are things that are non-standard concepts, blue are things that are standard concepts, and this like purpley color is things that are classification systems. And so it's just trying to provide you a visual representation of what those things actually are. So for example, if I'm looking for atrial fibrillation, what I really want to get to is what is going to be that standard concept of atrial fibrillation that I'm interested in. So I could filter this list down to things that are standard simply by clicking on standard. And I can see that there's many different domains, but I'm thinking about the clinical notion of atrial fibrillation, which would be a condition. And so I could further filter down to condition concepts. And you can see by those two filters, I now am down from whatever that was, 164 things. I'm now down to 20 different concepts. All of these things contain the string atrial fibrillation. And I'm showing you 15 of them here. But I can see that there's one here, atrial fibrillation, which happens to be the exact verbatim string that I was searching for. So I might be interested in selecting this node of the vocabulary as the first place that I want to explore. So I'm just going to click on atrial fibrillation. I just clicked on that link there so I could get to this row. And you can see all of the details about that particular concept. So I have selected atrial fibrillation. It's a standard concept. It comes from the SNOMED vocabulary. And if you are someone who knows a lot about SNOMED codes off the top of your head, then you'll clearly remember good old 49436004, which is the SNOMED identifier for atrial fibrillation. But beyond having the details of what this one concept is, I might want to say, well, what things are related to atrial fibrillation? And so the Related Concepts tab allows me to see all of the ways that I can relate either directly or through that ancestry table to learn medical ideas about atrial fibrillation. So for example, here now that I've clicked on Related Concepts, I can see different types of information. I will sort down just to show you one, for example. I might be interested in what are the, let's say, ancestors of atrial fibrillation. And let's see, I'll sort it this way so you can see. So just as I showed you in the cartoon, atrial fibrillation has an ancestor of atrial arrhythmia and fibrillation. And that is one step, one hop in the vocabulary to learn that particular insight. I'm sorry, on the left-hand side, I just filtered down to relationships of have an ancestor.
Oh, has ancestor of.
Yeah, has ancestor of, sorry, yep. And so just to get to that particular case, and then you can see that by sorting on the distance, it's basically sorted on how many hops do I have to make to get from one idea to another. And so we can see that atrial fibrillation is an atrial arrhythmia, which is a cardiac arrhythmia, which is a heart disease, which is a cardiac finding, so on and so forth. Okay, so with this one page, we can kind of navigate that space. Now, another thing that's quite common that people are interested in when they think about what's related is they might be interested in what source codes that I am comfortable with in my data roll up to this idea of atrial fibrillation. So in particular, if we think about, those of you who are still like to think about ICD-9 codes because you can find them in the literature, and this weird, funky atrial fibrillation SNOMED concept, I don't know how that relates to ICD-9 codes. So in the vocabulary, we could just say, well, let's just filter to relationships with ICD-9 codes. And just by selecting ICD-9 there, we can see that there are 2 ICD-9 codes that are non-standard, but that map up to this notion of atrial fibrillation. And what is it here? 427.3, atrial fibrillation and flutter, and 427.31, atrial fibrillation.
Okay. I'm trying it and I'm not seeing anything because I still have relationship selected. How do you clear the stuff you already clicked on?
Oh, just click again and it'll unselect it.
Okay.
So on the left-hand side filters, if you click on one, it filters it. You click again and you're unfiltered. So the point here is that we have defined a standard way to define atrial fibrillation as this one concept, atrial fibrillation. But if we were to apply that to a database whose data was only in ICD-9, then that one standard idea of atrial fibrillation would manifest itself as looking for the codes 427.3 or 427.31. But why this is powerful is because some databases might have ICD-9, like a US claims database pre-October 2015, but other databases might have ICD-10. And so I've unselected ICD-9, selected ICD-10, and we can see here that in the ICD-10 world, there's actually 6 concepts for atrial fibrillation that could potentially be coded. So somewhere else in the world that they were already using ICD-10, this would be the manifestation of those codes in their particular data. Yes, question.
There's nothing standard for ICD-10 codes that would be standard in your vocabulary or standard in your concept?
So the question is, there's nothing standard for ICD-9 codes. Is that the question?
Well, I was just wondering, like, how do you get to the idea of standard if an ICD code is standard?
Yeah. So the question is standard. So, so as a community, we have decided on vocabulary standards for each of our clinical domains, and then mapped other coding system vocabularies into those standards. So in the case of this clinical domain of conditions, we are using SNOMED as a standard vocabulary. And that means we've got some people have ICD-9, some people have ICD-10, some people have read codes, some people have other things. What we tried to do, and we continue to evolve it, but what we try to do is figure out a standard that'll actually work for everybody. And one of the real challenges with ICD specifically is, well, ICD-9 is a train wreck, and it's not really being used anymore. ICD-10 is pretty broad and has a lot of things, but for example, ICD-10 is not even one thing. You've got ICD-10 internationally, you've got ICD-10 CM in the US, and there's a lot of mixtures going on. SNOMED is an international standard that most countries are kind of getting behind, and so we are mapping codes like ICD-9, ICD-10, ICD-10-CM into SNOMED as our standard. Yes?
How do you handle a situation where an investigator says, I have my own list of ICD-10 codes, and that's what I want to use for definition?
So the question is, how do you handle this situation where somebody starts with, yeah, but I read a paper and it told me that I should use this particular ICD-9 code. What should I do? And so thank you for that case. Let's imagine that that Graham paper happened to have given us an ICD-9 code, and it had been 427.3, atrial fibrillation. So just like I searched for the concept atrial fibrillation, I could also just search for the code that I'm looking for. So I'll just go back to the search, and what was that number? I already forgot it. 427.3. Okay. So I'll just search straight for that code, and because that's going to be contained in there, you're going to see, okay, well, there are multiple codes that contain that. I'll pick one that's interesting there, atrial fibrillation. And so now we can see I've selected that. I'm now on that code, and now we can start to ask questions like, well, how do I get to a standard on the basis of that? And so, again, using the exact same structure, using the related concepts, we can now start to ask the question like, I'm on this concept. Does it get you anywhere to a standard concept? And we can see in this particular case, there was a relation to another ICD-9 code, cardiac dysrhythmias, but there is a relationship here to that very one we were on, atrial fibrillation, which is now the standard concept. And so very, very common in my research and what we do at Janssen, it's not to it's pretty common that someone like Dan comes to me with a paper that we might want to replicate that has a list of ICD-9 codes, in which case we will be able to use that code list as a starting point to explore, to find standards. I would say, though, and one of the real values of this vocabulary is it is quite common that by going through that process, we find other codes that should have been included in that definition, but were missed or weren't found or whatever. And so using the vocabulary as an exploratory process very, very often, say almost always, actually creates a definition that we have greater confidence in because we learn more about those vocabularies. And in particular, for those of you who are in the US who are still coming to terms with the fact that we've already shifted over to ICD-10, everybody who has this weird intuition about ICD-9 and can rattle off things like, you know, type 2 diabetes is 250 star and MI is 410 star. Like all of those intuitions, they're gone now that we're in the ICD-10 world. And so all those papers that you pull out to say, this is how we're going to define it in ICD-9, they do not apply to your data in an post-October 2015. So you either need to live in a world where you're going to create an ICD-9 code set and separately create an ICD-10 code set and hope those two things might have something to do with each other. Or you can think about using the standard vocabulary as a way to actually create a standard and then see how it manifests as ICD-9 codes and ICD-10 codes, and have the added benefit that now you're creating an international definition that can then also go apply to the UK with a read code or to Korea with a different coding system. Yes?
Follow up on that. Once you have all this, so you searched your codes, and you have like 10 codes that you want to save, and you don't want to keep it. Do you need to keep it in an Excel spreadsheet, or can you keep it inside the tool?
Is Excel an open source software tool?
Or CSV?
Well, that's better. That's better, but I'm just teasing.
Can I hold those 10 codes somewhere
Yep.
and come back to it in a month?
Yep.
I see a shopping
So,
cart.
yes. So I'll well, actually, let me do it as a let's use atrial fibrillation as the example for that. So we noticed that there was this thing, atrial fibrillation, and there's also atrial flutter. And just for the thought experiment, imagine you wanted those two things together because that's what you really had in mind. Okay. So there's one concept for atrial fibrillation. I'll click on it here. Okay. And there was a separate concept for atrial flutter. You might want to create a group of those things together and save that so you can use it for your research. That's what we refer to as a concept set. A concept set is a set of concepts because we're not very creative with names. So how would I add things to my to create a concept set or add things? As was already pointed out, you've got a little shopping cart over here. So I can literally just click on the shopping cart, and you can see I've created a new concept set. If I click on this concept set, you can see that now I've started to create something called a concept set expression. And this concept set expression is going to contain as many things as I want to represent the group of codes that I'm interested in. So I'm going to make this right now. We've got the OHDSI, what's this, ecosystem tutorial, and we're going to make a concept for atrial fibrillation or flutter. Okay? So I'm just going to save this as a concept set. And while I'm on here, you're going to notice that I've asked for the concept atrial fibrillation, but you remember that hierarchy I showed you that there was lots of things underneath of atrial fibrillation. And we could make a presumption that I don't just want the verbatim code atrial fibrillation, but if there's anything that's a more specific version of atrial fibrillation, I want that too. Okay? So when you create a concept set expression, I can actually say, give me that concept and its descendants using that concept ancestry idea. And now we can see that this one expression, atrial fibrillation and its descendants, actually includes 13 different concepts. And if we just want to see what they are, you can see that now with that one simple expression, any of these different standard codes that we observe in our data will be part of our standard definition. Now, I've selected this, but let's say that we weren't done. We want atrial flutter. I'll go back to the search. I'll look for atrial flutter. I've searched for it, and we can see lots of standard and non-standard things come back. But we can see here's one that's in blue, and the blues are standard, so I'll just click on that guy. and maybe we'll read about it. It's a SNOMED concept. It's a standard. We might be interested. I showed you the related concepts, so I'll just show you another view. We could also see how this relates to things in the hierarchy, so basically looking at the parent-child relationships. And we can see that atrial flutter is an atrial arrhythmia, and that other one we saw, atrial fibrillation, was also an atrial arrhythmia. And we can see that atrial flutter actually by itself has its own set of children, more specific concepts for atrial flutter. So I might like this idea. I can add that to my shopping cart. And if I go back to my concept set, you can now see that I have created one concept set called atrial fibrillation or flutter. It's defined by two different concepts. And for those two concepts, we're saying use this concept and all of its descendants. And that definition there, while this is a fairly straightforward expression, that expression can manifest itself as a pretty large set of concepts. And importantly, that'll then turn into the source codes, which are the things you're actually going to be looking for in your own source data. So for example, if I think I'm texting my half bar here. We can see there that the included concepts, there were now 19 different concepts that roll up to this one concept set. And that is going to turn into a lot of different source codes, being ICD-9, ICD-10, READ, whatever, as the different ways that would actually be represented in source data.
So how do you add a new concept to your included source codes? So you clicked on the shopping cart to add one, and you added one, but now let's say you're editing it. Well, how do you delete or add more?
So if this loads, I'll go right back there. But on that concept set expression, you can delete from that list if you want to. You can click on the descendant buttons and look at that. When you want to explore the vocabulary to find other items that you want to add, you just go back to the vocabulary, you search for the thing you want, click on a shopping cart, and you're now adding to that concept set.
Much better than Excel.
Yes, much better than Excel. I'm not a Microsoft hater. I just think I will say that one of the banes of my existence as an epidemiologist has been receiving an Excel file of ICD-9 codes, and Excel does the thing to help you by formatting, and you lose the 5th digit 0. I have multiple papers that I feel like I potentially should retract on the basis of Excel helping me. So yeah, I don't want to do that anymore. Okay, this is being laggy. So I apologize for that. But to show how you would remove something, so if you click on the shopping cart to add it, you click on the shopping cart again to remove it. So if I were to remove atrial flutter there, I just click on the button and it would remove it. Okay. So I'm going to actually stop here into the vocabulary. There's an awful lot about the vocabulary to explore and enrich your use, but a couple points in from some of the questions I got, I want to reinforce this. So the vocabulary itself is just we're gonna be timing out on things. The vocabulary itself is just a set of tables, and you've got concepts, concept relationships. The Atlas tool allows you to search for those concepts and explore those relationships. For purposes of studies, it's very common that you want to create your own groupings of concepts to do your research, in which case this notion of a concept set is a way for you to create an expression that defines the set of codes that you want. And then once you have those concept sets, as we're going to show you through the rest of the tools, you'll be able to use those concept sets to create cohorts, and you'll be able to use those cohorts to conduct analyses. And so this becomes kind of a building block from where we're at. Okay, Connor.
On the last screen, if you go to export, you can show all the concepts out there.
What's that?
On the last screen that you were at,
Yeah, let me go back to here.
you can click on the export one. That's really quick.
So the export here. Yeah, thank you. So the other tabs that I could have mentioned here. So this export tab. Let's say that I created a definition of atrial fibrillation and flutter that I want to share with somebody else in the world. So we can actually export this expression as a standardized code element to pass along. You can also see the specific concepts that were included in the list and all the included concept identifiers. So this is a stored object inside of your database that basically becomes a reusable artifact. important note is because Atlas is a shared platform, now that I just created this shared, this definition of atrial fibrillation flutter, for those of you who do have sufficient broadband, if you click on the concept set list, you will actually see that definition that we just created right here. Atrial fibrillation or flutter. So what this means is you could have one environment in your own institution of Atlas, and different researchers can create different concept sets and reuse them as artifacts throughout all of your designs. So this enables collaboration within your own institution, and by exporting things, it also allows you to collaborate with other institutions as well. Okay.
How would you import a code that exported?
Yep, so if you were to go to the search, there's I'm sorry, the question was, how would I, if somebody exported something and gave it to me, how would I import it? So in your vocabulary search, there is a tab for importing, and so you could just import either a concept set, well, actually this one's open, so I can't do that. Let me close that.
Is that search?
In search, there's a vocabulary, and you can either import as a concept set, concept identifiers, or source codes. And so you could then use that as your way to pull in something.
It tells me please close your current concept set.
Yep. So if you're in the concept set, you got to close that one first, and then once you're in there, you can just create a new one.
There's a lot of functionality in the concept set expression framework that took me months to learn about. There's a function called optimize. There's a function called let's take two concept sets and compare them. There is the evidence button there. So we can continue this concept set itself, and it will be an advanced tutorial. And then there is the backend portion of it. How does the APIs work, and so on and so forth.
So we're going to transition now to data sources. We wanted to do the vocabulary first, and we want to do the vocabulary first because we want to make sure that at least in terms of language that we're speaking to each other, you guys can get the notion of that we're going to use these words concepts and to be able to explore those. But now Kristen's going to show some slides.